Hey, gang, and welcome to another exciting episode of Biology Online. And today we're going to talk about community ecology. And so, this is kind of like the second part of our series on ecology. Last time it was population ecology, and now we're going to look at community ecology. So, with population ecology, we're looking at just one species in an area. And now we're going to be looking at all the different species in the area. So, kind of to get us started, community is just defined as it's multiple populations living together in the same area, and you can imagine that a lot of interactions are going to come based off of that. So one of the first things that we look at whenever we want to study a community is we need to look at what's called the species diversity. Just what are the types of species living in the area, and how many of them are there? What's the number of species and what's the number of individuals of each species? That's some of the first information we would need to collect. We'd also want to collect the same stuff from population data, the number of individuals, their density, and how they're spread. But with species diversity, generally the more species that we have, the better the overall health of that particular community. Whenever we start looking at communities, there's a index that we use called the Shannon Diversity Index, and it's a way for us to mathematically make sense of the diversity of individuals or types of species that are in the community. And here you can see I have the Shannon Diversity Index outlined for us, and there's a bunch of different symbols on here. This is actually this is a calculus equation, which in science, these things are wonderful. It may look really confusing right now, but it's really not. Think of it as just variables in like algebra, A's, B's, and C's, and X's and Y's. Same thing here. All of these values up here just mean something. They represent an actual number that we can go back and plug in. And then we just follow the math, which is really easy, and just punch numbers in the calculator, and there we have it. With the Shannon Diversity Index, the first thing you need to know is that the scale that it runs on mathematically runs between 1 and 3, 1 being low diversity, and 3 being high. So you'd probably think that right around 2 is average, and 2.5 is high, 1.5 is actually really low. The higher the number, the better the diversity. So what do all the parts of the Shannon Diversity Index actually mean? Well, here's our equation. You may have seen some of these symbols before. H literally just means the Shannon Diversity Index. So they could have wrote SDI here for Shannon Diversity Index. So Shannon Diversity Index is equal to the negative of something over here, right? You've probably seen this symbol before. If you're going to be in a fraternity or a sorority, get used to this symbol. You're going to see a lot. This is sigma, and it means to add up everything behind it. That's what sigma stands for in math. It just means the sum of everything that follows. Because keep in mind, when we're doing species diversity, if you're thinking of diversity index, we're looking at communities, and there's more than one species. So you're going to add up a bunch of numbers for all the individual species. So you'll have a column of all these different numbers, each number representing a different species. And what are you going to do with it? You're going to add them all up. You're just going to add up the column of numbers and get a total. That's what sigma means. PI stands for the percent. Just like you would find on an exam. If you got a 35 out of 40, how would you find what percent you actually made? Well, you divide the part by the whole, right? So it'd be 35 divided by 40, and that would give you a decimal number. Multiply it by 100, and that would give you the percent. For us, we're just going to leave it at the decimal number. So it's just the part divided by the whole. So how many individuals of one species did we find over the total number of individuals of all the species? And then the L in PI is just the natural log of the PI. So the natural log of the percent. But the thing is, whenever we take the natural log of a number, we get a negative. And if you add up a bunch of negatives, negative, 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 plus a negative, plus a negative, plus a negative, it's just going to give you a negative number. It doesn't really sound nice if you say, hey, what's the species diversity? Oh, it's a -2. It makes it sound like we've actually, lost everything plus 2. And that doesn't really work out. So we don't like to use that negative number. So what do? How do you get rid of a negative number? 2 ways. You can either just take the absolute value, or you can multiply that negative number by another negative. So what does this negative in front of the sigma mean? It just means whatever you get is going to be negative. Multiply it by a negative, or just take the absolute value. So that way your number is positive. You end up with a number between 1 and 3. 3 being high diversity and 1 being really low diversity. You can imagine that the higher the diversity, the better, right? The more things living there, the more they can interact and interplay, and usually the healthier the ecosystem is going to be. So whenever we're talking about community ecology and we talk about doing a study, it's important to know that community ecology, when you say all the species living in an area, that is a lot of species. That's all of the bacteria. And there could be thousands of species of just that in a little bit of soil. It's all of the protist. It's all of the fungi. It's all of the plants, and it's all of the animals. So that could be overwhelming. Maybe that's not exactly what we want to look at. Maybe we don't need all of that information. So it's important to know that you get to define your parameters when you do an ecological study. And one of the first things you'll want to do is to determine the habitat that you're going to study for your community. So what's a habitat? Well, it's just all of the environment where organisms naturally live, just their natural habitat. For instance, here is a beach habitat, right? So we've got a pond or a lake next to a shore, and we've got a bunch of different shorebirds that are feeding on there. One of the things that you'll start to notice when you start to do your study and you look at all the different species and how they act and interact is that they're all separated into what we call niches. A niche is just the specific job that you have in your ecosystem. Nature does not want to, things in nature don't want to wastefully lose energy. Competition, fighting over resources, that costs too much energy and there's a lot of risk involved in that. That's not beneficial. You want low risk and high reward, right? As much of a reward you can get without risking injury. So what happens is that all of the species of birds that we have here, though they feed in the same habitat, they never feed in places that overlap with other species. They have their own niches, their own specific jobs within that habitat that they do and that they fulfill. It's kind of how they live. For example, so here we have these plovers. Plovers live way up, furthest away from the water, in sandy, soily area, and they go around and they pick out small insects from the soil. Whereas oyster catchers also live up on the sandy shores, but they a little bit closer to the water. And they tend to go in areas where there's bivalves and pick them out. That's why they're called oyster catchers, right? If these two different species overlapped and shared the same habitat and fed from the same food source, there would be competition. There would be a winner and there would be a loser. But by separating exactly where they are within this pretty small area, they have removed competition. They don't compete. This one doesn't eat oysters closer to the shore. This one doesn't eat the insects in the sand and soil further away from soil. So these are their niches. These are their specific jobs within those habitats. And the same thing for the avocet. It feeds in water just off the shore. Doesn't really go up on the shore. Doesn't really go too deep. Just stays in kind of like ankle or knee deep water. Ducks, however, will go a little bit further out and they dive down to the bottom and they feed off the plants that are growing at the bottom. Whereas flamingos also feed far out, but they don't feed off the plants. They filter feed through the sediment at the bottom. So that way, even though they're feeding in the same area, they're not eating the same food source. So there's no need for competition. This is a natural product that we see that occurs through evolution. The idea of resources being limited, things are going to compete. When things compete, not all things are identical or have the same traits. Some have better traits that allow them to do better in those particular niches. And through the process of natural selection, we end up with a winner and a loser, and the winner gets his resource and passes that on, those traits on to their offspring, which allows them to do better, and so forth and so on. And so you end up with these little niches, these little jobs that each of these can do to help them survive. Again, the idea here is that we're reducing the amount of competition. You don't want to compete if it's not necessary. There's too much at risk. If you're a bird and you get injured, or if you're an animal and you get injured in nature, there's no hospital for you to go to. So it's very much to your benefit to don't compete if at all possible. And what does that lead to? This idea of these niches. And we'll talk about that a little bit more from a different viewpoint when we talk about resource partitioning.